In a quiet attic, hidden from a world at war, a young girl picked up her pen and began to write. Her words weren't meant for history books, yet they echo through time. Tonight, we slow down and walk gently through the story of Anne Frank, a story not just of fear and hiding, but of courage, hope, and the voice of a girl who dreamed of peace even when the world offered none. Let the stillness of night carry you through her journey. Softly, honestly, and with care, if you find comfort in quiet tales of real lives, bravery, and history's most human moments, you're in the right place. Just subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a night of peaceful reflection through forgotten pages of time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You might imagine that June 12, 1929 was an ordinary day in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, but for Otto and Edith Frank, it marked the beginning of an extraordinary story that would later captivate the world. Anne Frank House. In the Maingau Red Cross Clinic, Anneliese Marie Frank drew her first breath, a cheerful baby born into a Germany that was slowly unraveling at the seams. Frankfurt am Main in 1929 was a city caught between prosperity and despair. The Frank family lived in a spacious apartment on Marbachstrasse, in a comfortable residential area where middle-class Jewish families like themselves had built lives of relative security. Anne Frank House. Otto Frank worked in his family's bank, a business that had provided stability for generations, while Edith devoted herself to managing their household and caring for their daughters, 3-year-old Margot and now baby Anne. The details of Anne's earliest years reveal a child of remarkable vitality. She was described as cheerful and naughty, a toddler who brought laughter to their Frankfurt home. Anne Frank House. The family's housekeeper, Kathy, would later recall Anne's spirited nature, the way she would toddle through their apartment with infectious energy. These were the ordinary moments of an extraordinary childhood, a little girl learning to walk and talk, while the political ground beneath her family's feet began to shift in ways they could not yet fully comprehend. In these early years, the Frankfurt Jewish community represented about 30,000 people out of a population of nearly 560,000, a significant minority that had been integrated into German society for generations. Jewish families like the Franks had fought for Germany in World War I, contributed to its cultural and economic life, and considered themselves as German as any other citizen. Otto Frank himself had served as an officer in the German army during the Great War, earning him a level of respect and social standing that seemed to provide some protection against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. But even as Anne took her first steps in their Frankfurt apartment, troubling signs were emerging across Germany. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Encyclopedia. The economic devastation following World War I had left millions unemployed and desperate. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations on Germany, creating fertile ground for extremist political movements. In beer halls and political rallies across the country, a charismatic Austrian named Adolf Hitler was blaming Germany's problems on its Jewish population, spreading venomous lies that found eager audiences among the frustrated and dispossessed. The Frank family's daily routine in Frankfurt reflected the comfortable bourgeois lifestyle of educated German Jews. Otto would leave for the bank each morning, walking through streets where Jewish businesses had operated for decades. Edith would take the children to the park, where Anne would play with other children, her laughter mixing with German conversations that flowed as naturally as breathing. In the evenings, the family would gather for dinner, discussing the day's events in the warm glow of their dining room, unaware that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. As 1932 turned to 1933, the political situation deteriorated rapidly. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Encyclopedia. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party had been gaining momentum, exploiting economic desperation and promoting a toxic ideology that painted Jews as the source of Germany's problems. The party's propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, spread anti-Semitic messages through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public rallies, creating an atmosphere of hatred that would soon translate into official government policy. In Frankfurt, the Frank family watched with growing alarm as Nazi supporters marched through their streets, their brown uniforms and swastika armbands becoming an increasingly common sight. Anne Frank House, local Jewish businesses, began experiencing boycotts, and anti-Semitic graffiti appeared on walls throughout the city. Otto Frank, a man of careful observation and business acumen, recognized the warning signs that many others chose to ignore or dismiss as temporary political theater. The turning point came on January 30, 1933, when President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Encyclopedia. Within weeks, the Nazis began implementing their anti-Semitic agenda with bureaucratic efficiency that would become their hallmark. The first major blow came on April 7, 1933, with the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which expelled Jews and those deemed politically unreliable from government positions. For the Frank family, these developments were not abstract political events, but immediate threats to their survival and way of life. Otto Frank watched as Jewish colleagues lost their positions, as longtime friends and business associates began to distance themselves, and as the comfortable world he had known since childhood crumbled with breathtaking speed. The Germany that had been home to his family for generations was transforming into something alien and dangerous, a place where his daughters' futures were suddenly uncertain. As spring turned to summer in 1933, the anti-Semitic legislation continued to multiply with alarming frequency. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Encyclopedia. Jewish doctors were suspended from social welfare services, Jewish lawyers were forbidden from practicing, and Jewish students faced quotas limiting their access to education. Each new law represented another step toward the systematic exclusion of Jews from German society, a process that would eventually culminate in genocide. But in their Frankfurt apartment, 4-year-old Anne Frank continued to play with her toys, unaware that her world was about to change forever. How could a cheerful child understand that her very existence was being redefined by laws and regulations crafted by men she would never meet? What forces were gathering that would soon uproot her family and set them on a journey toward an uncertain future in a foreign land? The summer of 1933 brought a heat that seemed to intensify the political tensions simmering throughout Germany. Anne Frank House. For Otto and Edith Frank, the decision to leave their homeland was not made lightly or suddenly, but gradually, as each passing day brought new evidence that their Germany no longer existed. The tipping point came when Otto realized that his business prospects were evaporating along with his civil rights, and that staying would mean condemning his daughters to a future of persecution and diminished possibilities. Otto Frank's decision to explore opportunities in the Netherlands was both practical and prescient. Anne Frank House Amsterdam offered several advantages. Its proximity to Germany would allow for easier maintenance of business connections. Its tradition of religious tolerance provided hope for a more secure future, and its thriving commercial sector presented opportunities for a man with Otto's banking and business experience. In July 1933, while Anne continued to play in their Frankfurt apartment, Otto made the painful journey to Amsterdam to establish a new life for his family. The separation was difficult for everyone, but perhaps most challenging for Edith, who found herself managing two young children while her husband worked to build their future in a foreign country. Anne Frank House. Margot, now 6 years old, was beginning to understand that something significant was happening to their family, while 4-year-old Anne remained largely oblivious to the adult anxieties swirling around her. The long months of 1933 stretched out as Otto established Opekta Works, a company that would manufacture and distribute pectin, a substance used in jam making, and searched for suitable housing for his family. Finally, in February 1934, the reunion came. Anne Frank House. Anne Frank arrived in Amsterdam as a 5-year-old German refugee, though she would have understood none of the political complexities that had brought her family to this new country. For Anne, Amsterdam was simply a grand adventure, a new place to explore with canals to wonder at and Dutch words to learn. The family settled into a comfortable apartment at 37 Merwedeplein in the Rivierenbuurt district, an area that was home to many German Jewish refugees who had made similar journeys. The Amsterdam that welcomed the Frank family in 1934 was a city with a long tradition of tolerance and commercial enterprise. The Netherlands had been a refuge for persecuted minorities for centuries, from Portuguese Jews fleeing the Inquisition to French Huguenots escaping religious persecution. This history of openness meant that the Frank family was not alone in their refugee status. They joined a growing community of German Jews who had recognized the dangers of remaining in Hitler's Germany and had made the difficult decision to start over in a new country. Anne's adaptation to Amsterdam life reveals much about her resilient and social nature. She quickly learned Dutch, made friends with local children, and began attending the Montessori school in the neighborhood, Anne Frank House. Her teachers noted her intelligence and vivacious personality, her love of books and writing, and her natural ability to lead and organize her classmates. These were the formative years when Anne's character was developing, when her passion for literature and storytelling began to emerge. Meanwhile, Otto Frank's business, Opekta Works, was gradually establishing itself in the Dutch market. He hired Dutch employees who would later become crucial to his family's survival: Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, and Bep Voskuil. Anne Frank House. These individuals were not just employees but became trusted friends and allies, people who shared Otto's values and who would prove their loyalty in ways that none of them could have imagined in those peaceful Amsterdam years. The Frank family's life in Amsterdam from 1934 to 1940 represents a period of relative normalcy and happiness. Anne Frank House. Anne grew from a 5-year-old refugee into an 11-year-old Dutch schoolgirl, fluent in the language and fully integrated into Amsterdam society. She developed close friendships, particularly with a girl named Hannah Goslar, and began to display the writing talent that would later make her famous. Her diary from these years, if it had existed, would have recorded the ordinary concerns of a bright, ambitious girl: school projects, friendship dramas, family outings, and her dreams for the future. But even as the Frank family was building their new life in Amsterdam, the situation in Germany continued to deteriorate. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Encyclopedia. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had stripped Jews of their German citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. By 1938, the November pogrom known as Kristallnacht had demonstrated the extent of Nazi brutality toward Jewish communities. Each piece of news from Germany confirmed that Otto Frank had made the right decision in moving his family to the Netherlands. However, the safety that Amsterdam provided was always precarious. As Hitler's military ambitions became clear, the threat of German expansion loomed over all of Europe. The Frank family, like many German Jewish refugees in the Netherlands, lived with the constant awareness that their security depended on the Dutch ability to remain neutral in any future conflict. This anxiety was particularly acute for Otto, who understood the geopolitical realities better than his daughters and who bore the weight of responsibility for his family's safety. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the subsequent declaration of war by Britain and France marked the beginning of World War II, but the Netherlands initially remained neutral. Anne Frank House. For several months, life in Amsterdam continued much as before. Anne attended school, played with her friends, and participated in the normal activities of a pre-adolescent girl. But beneath this surface normalcy, the adults, in her world, were watching the war's progression with growing dread, knowing that their refuge might soon be threatened. The period from 1934 to 1940 in Amsterdam gave Anne Frank the stable childhood years that allowed her personality and talents to develop. These were the years when she learned to love literature, when she began writing stories and poems, when she formed the friendships and developed the social skills that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead. In many ways, Amsterdam was where Anne Frank truly grew up, where she developed the intellectual curiosity and emotional maturity that would later enable her to create one of the most important documents of the 20th century. But as 1940 dawned, the war was moving closer to the Netherlands. German forces had already conquered much of Europe, and the small, neutral country's position was becoming increasingly untenable. For the Frank family, the question was no longer whether the war would reach them, but when and what they would do when it arrived. How long could this island of safety last in an ocean of conflict and persecution? Dawn on May 10, 1940, shattered the illusion of Dutch neutrality with the roar of German aircraft overhead. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. Anne Frank, now 11 years old, woke to a world that would never be the same. The German Wehrmacht launched its assault on the Netherlands, Belgium, and France simultaneously, and within 5 days the Dutch armed forces had surrendered. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government fled to London, leaving their country under Nazi occupation. For the Frank family, the occupation represented the return of the nightmare they had fled 7 years earlier. Anne Frank House, the sanctuary they had built in Amsterdam, was suddenly transformed into another version of the Germany they had escaped. Otto Frank watched with familiar dread as German troops marched through the streets of his adopted city, their jackboots echoing off the cobblestones and their swastika banners hanging from buildings that had once represented freedom and safety. The Nazi occupation of the Netherlands was swift and systematic. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was appointed as Reichskommissar, the civilian administrator responsible for implementing Nazi policies in the occupied territory. The Holocaust in the Netherlands. Unlike the military occupations in other countries, the Netherlands was subjected to a civilian administration that had one primary goal: the complete integration of the Dutch economy and society into the Nazi Empire, including the eventual elimination of its Jewish population. Initially, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to a young girl like Anne. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. The German authorities moved carefully at first, understanding that heavy-handed measures might provoke resistance. Schools continued to operate, businesses remained open, and daily life maintained a semblance of normalcy. But for the adult members of the Frank family, each passing day brought new anxieties and difficult decisions about how to protect their daughters while maintaining their dignity and livelihood. The first major anti-Semitic measure came in October 1940, when all civil servants were required to sign a declaration of Aryan ancestry. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Encyclopedia. This was followed by the requirement that all businesses with Jewish owners or employees be registered with the German authorities. Otto Frank found himself once again navigating the bureaucratic machinery of anti-Semitism, this time in a country he had hoped would provide permanent refuge for his family. As 1940 turned to 1941, the anti-Semitic measures escalated with the same methodical precision that the Frank family had witnessed in Germany. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam Jews were dismissed from public service positions, banned from public parks and swimming pools, and required to register their assets with the authorities. Each new regulation represented another brick in the wall of segregation that was being built around Amsterdam's Jewish community. The formation of the Amsterdam Jewish Council in February 1941 marked a significant escalation in Nazi control, the occupation of the Netherlands. This organization, supposedly established to represent Jewish interests, was actually a tool of German administration designed to facilitate the implementation of anti-Semitic policies by giving them a veneer of Jewish cooperation. The council was responsible for distributing German orders to the Jewish community and ensuring compliance with increasingly restrictive regulations. The February 1941 general strike in Amsterdam provided a brief moment of hope for the city's Jewish population. The Amsterdam general strike of February 1941, triggered by the deportation of several hundred young Jewish men to concentration camps, the strike was organized by the Communist Party and supported by thousands of Dutch workers. For 2 days, trams stopped running, factories closed, and Amsterdam came to a standstill in protest against the persecution of their Jewish neighbors. However, the strike was brutally suppressed by German forces, and its failure demonstrated the limits of resistance in occupied territory. The Amsterdam General Strike of February 1941. The organizers were arrested and executed, and the German authorities implemented even harsher measures against both the Jewish community and potential Dutch resistors. For families like the Franks, the failed strike was both inspiring and terrifying, proof that some Dutch citizens were willing to risk their lives to protect their Jewish neighbors, but also evidence of German determination to crush any opposition. By the summer of 1941, Jewish children were excluded from Dutch schools and forced to attend separate Jewish institutions. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. For Anne Frank, this meant leaving the Montessori school where she had spent her happiest years, in Amsterdam, and enrolling in the Jewish Lyceum. The segregation was particularly painful for a social girl like Anne, who suddenly found her world dramatically narrowed and her future possibilities limited. The establishment of the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam represented another step toward complete segregation. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam Jews were prohibited from living outside designated areas, and their movement within the city was increasingly restricted. The vibrant Jewish community that had welcomed the Frank family in 1934 was being systematically isolated and compressed, creating the conditions that would facilitate later deportations. Throughout 1941 and early 1942, Otto Frank watched these developments with growing alarm. Anne Frank House. As a businessman who had already fled one Nazi persecution, he understood better than many where these measures were leading. The systematic nature of the anti-Semitic policies, their gradual escalation, and their bureaucratic efficiency all pointed towards something far worse than mere discrimination or even segregation. In May 1942, Jews were required to wear yellow stars of David on their clothing, marking them for easy identification by German authorities and Dutch collaborators. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. For 13-year-old Anne Frank, the yellow star was both a humiliation and a revelation. The girl who had integrated so successfully into Dutch society was suddenly marked as different, dangerous, worthy of persecution. The star made every appearance in public a potential confrontation, every walk to school a reminder of her diminished status. July 6, 1942 dawned like any other summer morning in Amsterdam, but for the Frank family it marked the beginning of a journey into the shadows that would last over 2 years. Anne Frank House. The call-up notice for Margot Frank had accelerated. Plans that Otto Frank had been secretly developing for months. What began as a precautionary escape route had suddenly become a matter of life and death, and the family had mere hours to disappear from their ordinary life and vanish into the hidden world that would become known as the secret annex. The building at 2-63 Prinsengracht had served as the headquarters of Otto Frank's businesses since 1940, when he had moved Opekta Works from its previous location. Anne Frank House. The 4-story structure was typical of Amsterdam's canal-side commercial buildings, with office space on the lower floors and living quarters above. But unknown to most of its occupants and visitors, Otto Frank and his most trusted employees had been preparing a hiding place in the rear section of the building, accessible only through a concealed entrance that would soon become one of the most famous secret passages in history. The preparation for hiding had been methodical and careful, conducted under the noses of the German authorities and their Dutch collaborators. Anne Frank House, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, Miep Gies, and Bep Voskwijl, employees who had become far more than business associates, had spent months smuggling furniture, food, and supplies into the hidden rooms. Each item had to be transported, carefully disguised as normal business activity, with no indication that a secret refuge was being established. The architectural layout of the secret annex was both ingenious and cramped. Anne Frank House. The hiding place consisted of several rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors of the building's rear section, connected by narrow staircases and small landings. The ground floor contained a large room that would serve as the communal, living and dining area, while the upper floors were divided into smaller spaces for sleeping and private activities. The entire area measured approximately 450 square feet, smaller than most modern apartments, yet it would house 8 people for over 2 years. Anne Frank's first impression of the secret annex, recorded in her diary, captured both the adventure and the anxiety of their situation. Anne Frank House. At 13 years old, she was old enough to understand the gravity of their circumstances, but young enough to find excitement in the novelty of their hidden world. Her initial diary entries describe the rooms with the eye of a curious adolescent, noting the wallpaper, the furniture arrangement, and the small details that would become so familiar over the coming months. The Frank family was not alone in their hiding place. They were soon joined by Herman and Augusta van Pels, along with their 15-year-old son, Peter. Anne Frank House. Herman van Pels had been Otto Frank's business partner in the spice trade, and the two families had been friends for years. The addition of the Van Pels family made the secret annex even more crowded, but it also provided companionship and shared responsibility for the challenges of hidden life. Later, in November 1942, Fritz Pfeffer joined the group, bringing the total number of hidden occupants to 8. Anne Frank House Pfeffer was a dentist who had been forced to abandon his practice due to anti-Jewish laws. His arrival further strained the limited space and resources of the secret annex, but his presence also brought additional adult perspective and professional skills that proved valuable in their isolated community. The daily routine of life in hiding required extraordinary discipline and coordination. Anne Frank House. The 8 occupants had to maintain complete silence during business hours when the building's legitimate activities provided cover for their presence. This meant that from approximately 8:30 a.m. until 5:30 p.m. they could not use the toilet, run water, or make any noise that might be detected by workers in the warehouse below or visitors to the offices. The concealment of the secret annex entrance represented one of the most crucial elements of their security. Anne Frank House. Johannes Kleiman had commissioned a local carpenter to build a revolving bookcase that could be swung open to reveal the passage to the hidden rooms. This bookcase, filled with old business files and folders, appeared to be a permanent fixture of the office but could be opened by those who knew its secret. The bookcase became both a symbol of their ingenuity and a reminder of their vulnerability. Their survival depended on a single hidden door. The psychological challenges of entering hiding were as significant as the physical hardships. Anne Frank House. For the Frank family, July 6, 1942, marked the end of their normal life and the beginning of an indefinite period of isolation and uncertainty. They had no way of knowing how long the war would last, whether their hiding place would remain secure, or if they would ever be able to resume their previous existence. The decision to go into hiding was simultaneously an act of hope and despair. Hope that they could survive until liberation, despair that such extreme measures had become necessary. The supplies and provisions for extended hiding had been accumulated gradually over several months. Anne Frank House, canned goods, preserved foods, basic medications, clothing, books and educational materials had been smuggled into the secret annex piece by piece. The helpers had used their own ration cards and money to purchase supplies, often at great personal risk and financial sacrifice. Each can of food, each book, each piece of clothing represented not just a material necessity, but an act of courage and friendship. The transformation from normal family life to hidden existence required immediate and dramatic adjustments. Anne Frank House. Children who had been accustomed to attending school, playing with friends, and moving freely through their neighborhood suddenly found themselves confined to a few small rooms. Adults who had managed businesses, maintained social relationships, and participated in community life were reduced to whispered conversations and carefully rationed activities. Anne Frank's adaptation to life in hiding reveals much about her character and resilience. Anne Frank House. While the confinement was undoubtedly difficult, she approached it with a combination of teenage pragmatism and intellectual curiosity. Her diary became not just a record of events, but a creative outlet, a means of maintaining her sense of identity and purpose in circumstances that threatened to reduce her to mere survival. But even as the 8 occupants of the secret annex settled into their new reality, questions loomed over their daily existence. How long could they remain hidden without being discovered? What would happen if their helpers were arrested or could no longer provide support? How would they maintain their physical and mental health during an indefinite period of confinement? And perhaps most troubling of all, what was happening to the thousands of other Jewish families in Amsterdam who had not been able to find hiding places? The establishment of daily routines in the secret annex became a matter of survival as much as sanity. Anne Frank House. By late 1942, the 8 hidden occupants had developed a complex schedule that balanced their need for shared activities with the practical requirements of maintaining secrecy. Every aspect of their daily existence had to be carefully choreographed to avoid detection, creating a life that was simultaneously highly structured and unpredictably dangerous. The morning alarm at 6:45 a.m. belonged to Herman and August van Pels, whose small attic room served as the unofficial timekeeper for the entire secret annex. Anne Frank House. Herman would rise first, moving carefully in his stocking feet to the small kitchen area, where he would put the kettle on for morning tea. The 15 minutes he spent in the bathroom represented a carefully calculated luxury, enough time for basic hygiene, but not so long as to delay the complex rotation that followed. Fritz Pfeffer's turn came next, followed by Anne Frank, who had been assigned the crucial task of removing the blackout screens from the windows. Anne Frank House. This daily ritual required careful timing and complete silence, as the screens had to be removed before warehouse workers arrived, but not so early as to attract attention from neighbors or passers-by. Anne's responsibility for this task reflected both the trust placed in her, despite her young age, and the way that survival in hiding required everyone to contribute to their collective security. The most dangerous period of each day began at 8:30 a.m. when the warehouse workers arrived for their shifts. Anne Frank House. During this risky half hour, the 8 occupants of the secret annex had to maintain absolute silence while the building came to life below them. Any sound, a dropped book, a cough, the creak of a floorboard could potentially reveal their presence to workers who had no knowledge of their existence. The psychological pressure of enforced silence, while surrounded by the sounds of normal activity, created a daily test of nerves and discipline. Relief came at 9 a.m. when the office helpers arrived, and the building's legitimate business activities provided cover for limited movement and quiet conversation. Anne Frank House. Miep Gies, Bep Fosquile, Johannes Kleiman, and Victor Kugler brought not just physical supplies but psychological connection to the outside world. Their presence in the building meant that the sounds from the secret annex would be less likely to arouse suspicion, allowing its occupants to speak in whispers and move around their cramped quarters with greater freedom. The morning hours were typically devoted to education and intellectual activities. Anne Frank House. Otto. Frank had insisted that Anne and Margot continue their studies despite their confinement, recognizing that maintaining intellectual engagement was crucial for their long-term survival and future prospects. Anne studied French, English, history, and literature, while Margot focused on Latin, mathematics, and shorthand. Peter Van Pels, initially less academically inclined, gradually became more involved in educational activities under the influence of the Frank family's scholarly atmosphere. The lunch break at 12:30 p.m. represented the highlight of each day for the hidden occupants. Anne Frank House. When the warehouse workers left for their meal break, several of the helpers would join the secret annex residents for food and conversation. These daily gatherings provided crucial emotional sustenance, offering news from the outside world, discussion of war developments, and the simple pleasure of expanded social interaction. The 1 p.m. BBC Radio News broadcast became a daily ritual that connected the secret annex to the larger world. Anne Frank House. In an age before television or internet, radio represented the primary source of information about war progress and Allied advances. The 8 occupants would gather around their illegal radio set, listening intently for any news that might suggest their liberation was approaching. These broadcasts provided both hope and anxiety, as positive developments raised expectations while negative news highlighted their continued vulnerability. Food preparation and consumption required careful planning and strict rationing. Anne Frank House. The helpers provided whatever supplies they could obtain through their ration cards and black market connections, but the quality and quantity of food deteriorated significantly as the war progressed. Anne Frank House. By 1944, meals often consisted of the same vegetables for weeks at a time, endless servings of spinach, lettuce, and whatever preserved foods could be acquired. Anne complained in her diary about eating lettuce, stewing lettuce, spinach, and more spinach, but understood that even monotonous food was preferable to starvation. The afternoon hours brought a different rhythm to secret annex life. Anne Frank House. Most adults took naps to conserve energy and pass time, while Anne used these quiet hours for writing and studying. Her diary entries from this period reveal a young woman grappling with the normal challenges of adolescence, relationships, identity, dreams for the future. While living in circumstances that were anything but normal, the juxtaposition of teenage concerns with life-threatening danger created a unique perspective that would later captivate readers worldwide. Around 4 p.m., the secret annex residents would gather for coffee when it was available and begin preparations for dinner. Anne Frank House. This evening meal represented more than sustenance. It was a daily affirmation of their continued survival and their determination to maintain civilized routines despite their circumstances. Auguste Van Pels and Edith Frank shared cooking duties, creating meals from limited ingredients, while the others contributed to cleaning and preparation tasks. At 5:30 p.m., when the warehouse workers departed for the day, the secret annex came alive with activity. Anne Frank House. The departure of the last official employee meant that the hidden residents could move freely throughout the entire building for the first time since morning. This period of expanded freedom was precious, allowing them to use the office facilities, access stored supplies, and simply experience the psychological relief of unrestricted movement. The evening routine involved specific tasks that had become essential to their survival. Anne Frank House, Herman Van Pels would check the day's mail for any information relevant to their situation, while Peter Van Pels retrieved the bread that had been left for them in the office. Otto Frank used the office typewriter to conduct what remained of his business correspondence, maintaining the facade that Opecta Works continued to operate normally. Margot and Anne performed administrative tasks, helping to maintain the business records that provided cover for their hiding place. As darkness fell, the nightly ritual of blackout preparation began. Anne Frank House. Every window had to be covered to prevent any light from escaping and potentially attracting the attention of air raid wardens or German patrols. This daily task served as a reminder of the war raging outside their hidden world and the constant vigilance required for their survival. The hours after dinner provided the closest approximation to normal family life that the secret annex could offer. Anne Frank House. The 8 residents would read, engage in conversation, or listen to radio programs when reception permitted. These evening gatherings allowed for the discussion of philosophical questions, sharing of memories from better times, and the expression of hopes and fears about their uncertain future. Around 9 p.m., preparations for night began with the same careful coordination that characterized their entire daily routine. Anne Frank House furniture had to be moved to accommodate sleeping arrangements, particularly in the room shared by Herman and Augusta Van Pels, where the dining table was converted to bedroom space each evening. The bathroom rotation resumed, with each person taking turns for evening hygiene in the same careful order that had been established for morning activities. The psychological challenges of this highly regimented existence were immense. Anne Frank House 8, people from 3 different families, spanning 3 generations, were forced to live in intimate proximity with virtually no privacy and no escape from interpersonal tensions. Anne's diary records numerous conflicts between the adults, disagreements over child-rearing approaches, and her own struggles with feeling misunderstood and constrained by the opinions of her elders. The relationship between Anne and Peter Van Pels evolved significantly during their time in hiding, providing both young people with emotional support and companionship during their formative years. Anne Frank House. Their friendship deepened into romance, offering Anne her first experience of intimate emotional connection with someone her own age. These feelings, documented in her diary with typical teenage intensity, provided a counterbalance to the fear and uncertainty that dominated their daily existence. Winter in the secret annex brought additional hardships that tested the residents' endurance and resourcefulness. Anne Frank House. Heating fuel was scarce, requiring careful rationing and creative solutions to maintain tolerable temperatures. The shorter daylight hours meant longer periods of mandatory blackout, further restricting their already limited freedom of movement. Food shortages became more severe as the war progressed, and Dutch resistance to German occupation intensified. Yet despite these hardships, the secret annex residents maintained remarkable resilience and even moments of joy. Anne Frank House Anne's diary records celebrations of birthdays and holidays, creative games invented to pass time, and intellectual discussions that ranged from literature to philosophy to dreams for the post-war world. These moments of normalcy and happiness, achieved in circumstances of extraordinary danger and deprivation, testify to the human capacity for adaptation and hope. But as 1943 turned to 1944, external pressures on their hidden existence were mounting. How much longer could their helpers continue to provide support while avoiding detection? What would happen if food shortages made their situation unsustainable? And most ominously, what did the sounds of increased German activity in Amsterdam suggest about the progress of the war and their chances of surviving until liberation? The year 1944 began with cautious optimism in the secret annex, as Allied victories in Italy and increasing resistance activity throughout occupied Europe suggested that liberation might finally be approaching. Anne Frank House. But for the 8 hidden residents, each passing month brought not just hope, but also increased danger, as German security forces intensified their efforts to uncover hidden Jews and Dutch resistance networks. The delicate balance that had sustained their clandestine existence for nearly 2 years was becoming increasingly precarious. Anne Frank's diary entries from early 1944 reveal a young woman coming of age under extraordinary circumstances. Anne Frank House. Now 15 years old, she had spent crucial formative years in hiding, developing her identity and worldview in isolation from normal teenage experiences. Her writing during this period shows remarkable intellectual and emotional maturity as she grappled with questions of human nature, morality, and her own future in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. The relationship between Anne and Peter van Pels had evolved into genuine romance, providing both teenagers with emotional sustenance during their prolonged confinement. Anne Frank House. Their conversations in Peter's small attic room offered Anne a refuge from the tensions and restrictions of communal life, while giving both young people someone their own age with whom to share their fears, dreams, and developing understanding of themselves and the world around them. Food shortages had become a constant preoccupation by 1944 as the German authorities tightened rationing and the Dutch resistance sabotaged transportation networks. Anne Frank House. The helpers struggled to provide adequate nutrition for 8 additional people while managing their own families' needs. Meals in the secret annex became increasingly monotonous and inadequate, with the same vegetables appearing day after day and protein sources becoming extremely rare. The psychological strain of prolonged hiding was taking its toll on all the residents. Anne Frank House. Anne's diary records increasing conflicts between the adults, disagreements over discipline and daily routines, and her own growing frustration with the constraints of their existence. The cramped quarters, lack of privacy, and constant fear of discovery created tensions that occasionally erupted into arguments and hurt feelings that were difficult to resolve in such close confines. Outside the secret annex, the war was entering its final phase, though the outcome remained uncertain to those listening to radio broadcasts and piecing together information from their helpers. Anne Frank House. The June 6, 1944, D-Day invasion of Normandy brought tremendous excitement and hope to the hidden residents, who dared to believe that liberation might come within months. Anne wrote ecstatically about the Allied landings, imagining herself returning to school and resuming normal life before the end of the year. However, the German response to Allied advances included increased security measures and more intensive searches for hidden Jews and resistance members. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. The Amsterdam police, both German and Dutch collaborators, were conducting more frequent raids on buildings suspected of harboring fugitives. Each knock on the door, each unexpected visitor to the office below created moments of terror for the secret annex residents who knew that discovery would mean deportation and almost certain death. The helpers who had sustained the secret annex for nearly 2 years were themselves under increasing pressure. Anne Frank House, Miep Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, and Bep Voskuil had risked their lives daily to provide food, supplies, and moral support to the 8 hidden residents. By 1944, their activities had become more dangerous as German security services increased surveillance of Dutch citizens suspected of resistance activities. Despite these mounting pressures, daily life in the secret annex continued with the same careful routines that had sustained them for over 700 days. Anne Frank House. The morning alarm still sounded at 6:45 a.m. The bathroom rotation proceeded on schedule, and the dangerous half-hour of silence was observed while warehouse workers began their shifts. But everyone sensed that their situation was becoming unsustainable, that something would have to change soon, either liberation or discovery. Anne's writing during the summer of 1944 shows her growing awareness of her own mortality and her determination to leave something meaningful behind if she did not survive the war. Anne Frank House. She began revising her diary with an eye toward eventual publication, inspired by a Dutch government-in-exile radio broadcast calling for the preservation of war diaries and documents. This project gave her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival and reflected her growing understanding of the historical significance of her experience. The heat of summer 1944 made conditions in the secret annex even more difficult. Anne Frank House. The small, poorly ventilated rooms became stifling, while the requirement to keep windows closed during daylight hours for security reasons made the temperature almost unbearable. Sleep became difficult, tempers grew shorter, and the physical discomfort added another layer of stress to their already challenging existence. As July turned to August, the residents of the secret annex had no way of knowing that their time in hiding was about to end. Anne Frank House. They continued their daily routines, clung to hopes of liberation, and maintained the careful discipline that had kept them alive for 761 days. But somewhere in Amsterdam, information about their hiding place was making its way to German authorities, setting in motion the events that would bring their clandestine existence to a sudden and devastating conclusion. On the morning of August 4, 1944, Anne Frank wrote her final diary entry, unaware that it would be her last day of freedom. How could she have known that this ordinary summer morning would mark the end of everything they had built in their hidden world? What forces were converging that would soon shatter the fragile sanctuary they had created behind the revolving bookcase? And what would become of the diary that had sustained her through over 2 years of hiding, the diary that would soon become her most important legacy to the world? Friday, August 4th, 1944, dawned as a warm and sunny day in Amsterdam, the kind of summer morning that in peacetime would have invited thoughts of picnics in the park or bicycle rides along the canals. Anne Frank House. But for the 8 people hidden in the secret annex at 263 Prinsengracht, it was simply the 761st day of their confinement, beginning like so many others with the familiar alarm at 6:45 a.m. and the careful orchestration of silence, movement, and survival that had become their daily existence. The morning routine proceeded normally, with Herman van Pels rising first to put the kettle on for tea, followed by the bathroom rotation and Anne's careful removal of the blackout screens. Anne Frank House. The dangerous half-hour of silence was observed as warehouse workers arrived for their shifts, and by 9:00 a.m. the hidden residents had settled into their usual morning activities, reading, studying, and waiting for the lunch break that would bring their helpers and news from the outside world. In the office below, the business of Opekta Works continued its facade of normalcy. Annie Frank House, Miep Gies, Bep Vosquile, Johannes Kleiman, and Victor Kugler went about their daily tasks, maintaining the cover that had protected the secret annex for over 2 years. They had no way of knowing that somewhere in Amsterdam, a phone call had been made to German authorities, providing information that would bring their carefully constructed world crashing down within hours. Between 10:30 and 11 a.m., the sound that had haunted the nightmares of every hidden Jew in Amsterdam finally came to 263 Prinsengracht, the heavy footsteps and authoritative voices of German police officers entering the building. Anne Frank House, SS Hauptscharführer Karl Josef Silberbauer lead the team, a man whose routine efficiency in implementing Nazi persecution would forever link his name to one of history's most tragic stories. The officers first encountered Willem van Maren, the warehouse employee who directed them to the first-floor offices where the business staff worked. Anne Frank House, Miep Gies, later recalled the moment when a short man came in holding a revolver that was pointed at me. The casual brutality of the scene, armed men disrupting a normal business day, represented the arbitrary power that Nazi authority wielded over ordinary Dutch citizens. Victor Kugler was questioned and then forced to accompany the officers as they searched the building. Anne Frank House. The methodical inspection proceeded through the warehouse and offices with German thoroughness applied to uncovering any evidence of illegal activity. In the storeroom, they forced open crates, sacks, and containers, looking for hidden contraband or concealed entrances to hiding places. The moment of discovery came when the officers reached the landing with the revolving bookcase, Anne Frank House. While casual observers might not have noticed anything unusual about the bookcase filled with business files, the trained eyes of security police were more discerning. Whether through prior information, careful observation, or simple suspicion, they recognized that the bookcase concealed something significant. When the bookcase swung open to reveal the entrance to the secret annex, over 2 years of careful concealment and desperate hope ended in an instant. Anne Frank House. Otto Frank later recalled the scene. My wife, the children, and the Van Pels family all stood there with their hands up in the air. The image of Anne Frank, now 15 years old, standing with her hands raised in surrender, represents one of the most heartbreaking moments in Holocaust history. Fritz Pfeffer was brought from his hiding place to join the others in the main room of the secret annex, Anne Frank House. The 8 people who had created a hidden community of survival and hope were now standing together for what would be the last time in the place that had been their world for 761 days. The careful routines, the shared meals, the whispered conversations, the dreams of liberation, all of it ended in the space of a few terrifying minutes. Karl Silberbauer demanded that the captives surrender their valuables, a standard procedure in Nazi arrests that combined theft with humiliation. Anne Frank House. Otto Frank offered his briefcase, which contained Anne's diary papers, along with other documents. Silberbauer emptied the briefcase to use it for storing the confiscated valuables, and Anne's precious diary pages scattered across the wooden floor like fallen leaves, the voice that would later speak to millions reduced to scattered papers ignored by her captors. The arrest of the helpers Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler demonstrated the price of resistance and compassion under Nazi occupation. Anne Frank House. These men, who had risked their lives daily for over 2 years to sustain the secret annex, were now facing deportation and imprisonment for their acts of humanity. Their courage in helping their Jewish friends and colleagues represented the best of human nature in the face of systematic evil. By approximately 1 p.m., the raid was complete. Anne Frank House. The 10 arrestees, 8 from the secret annex, and 2 helpers were loaded into a police van for transport to German detention facilities. The building at 263 Prinzengracht, which had harbored its secret for over 2 years, was now empty of its hidden residents, but full of evidence of the lives that had been lived there. Furniture, clothing, books, and scattered on the floor, the diary pages that would soon become Anne Frank's immortal legacy. In the hours following the arrest, Miep Gies and Bep Voskuil returned to the secret annex with Willem van Maren to assess what remained. Anne Frank House. Among the chaos left by the German search, they found Anne's diary papers scattered across the floor. These 2 brave women gathered up the pages and took them to the office, where Miep stored them in her desk drawer, not knowing that she was preserving one of the most important documents of the 20th century. The August 4th, 1944, arrest represented more than the end of one family's story. It symbolized the systematic destruction of European Jewry that was nearing completion by the summer of 1944. Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. The Frank family and their companions were among the last Jews remaining in Amsterdam, survivors of a deportation process that had already claimed the vast majority of the city's Jewish population. But who had betrayed them? Anne Frank House. The question would haunt historians and investigators for decades, generating theories and accusations but never producing definitive answers. The anonymous phone call that led to their discovery remains one of history's most consequential acts of betrayal, changing the course of countless lives and robbing the world of the potential contributions of 8 remarkable people. As the police van carrying Anne Frank and her companions disappeared into the streets of Amsterdam, their journey into the machinery of Nazi genocide was just beginning. What awaited them in the detention centers and transit camps that served as way stations to the death camps of Eastern Europe? How would they face the systematic dehumanization designed to break their spirit before destroying their bodies? And could any of them have imagined that one 15-year-old girl's diary would eventually speak for all the victims of the Holocaust? The police van that carried Anne Frank and her 7 companions away from Prinzengracht 263 delivered them first to the SD headquarters on Utrechtstraat, where the machinery of Nazi persecution began its methodical processing of 8 more Jewish lives. Anne Frank House. The building, which served as the Amsterdam headquarters for the security police, had processed thousands of Jewish prisoners since the occupation began, and the Frank family's arrival represented just another routine day in the systematic destruction of Dutch Jewry. The interrogation procedures at Utrechtstraat followed established protocols designed to extract information about other hidden Jews and resistance activities. Anne Frank House. The 8 prisoners from the secret annex were questioned about other hiding places they might know, sources of support they had received, and any connections to organized resistance networks. The German authorities understood that each captured Jew potentially held information that could lead to additional arrests and the uncovering of broader support networks. After their interrogation, the prisoners were separated according to Nazi administrative categories. Anne Frank House. The helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, were classified as Dutch political prisoners and sent to the detention center at Amstelveense, while the 8 Jewish prisoners were transported to the Weteringschans facility. This separation marked the beginning of a process that would systematically strip away their individual identities and reduce them to categories in the Nazi bureaucracy of persecution. The conditions at Vetteringschans prison provided Anne Frank with her first direct experience of Nazi detention facilities, Encyclopedia of Amsterdam. The overcrowded cells, inadequate food, and deliberate humiliation were designed not just to contain prisoners, but to begin the psychological destruction that was an integral part of the Holocaust. For a 15-year-old who had spent over 2 years in the relative comfort of the secret annex, the harsh reality of prison conditions must have been a profound shock. On September 3, 1944, the Frank family and their companions were loaded onto what would be the last passenger train from Amsterdam to Westerbork Transit Camp, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This transport carried 1 through 19 prisoners, representing the final major deportation of Jews from the Netherlands. Among the passengers were families who had been in hiding, individuals caught in the final roundups, and others who had managed to evade capture until the very end of the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam. Westerbork Transit Camp, located in the northeastern Netherlands, had been operating since 1942 as a collection point for Dutch Jews waiting deportation to concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Originally built to house German Jewish refugees who had fled to the Netherlands in the 1930s, the camp had been transformed by the Nazis into a crucial link in the deportation chain that would ultimately transport over 100,000 Dutch Jews to their deaths. The journey to Westerbork by passenger train created a cruel illusion of normal travel as families sat in regular compartments while being transported to their likely doom. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The use of passenger trains rather than cattle cars was part of the Nazi deception strategy in the Netherlands, designed to reduce panic and resistance by maintaining the fiction that deportees were being relocated for work purposes rather than systematic murder. Upon arrival at Westerbork, the Frank family encountered a surreal world that combined the appearance of normal community life with the reality of a concentration camp. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The camp contained barracks, workshops, schools, and even cultural activities, all designed to maintain the illusion that Westerbork was a temporary resettlement community rather than a way station to death camps. This elaborate deception helped maintain order and reduce resistance among the prisoners while Nazi authorities prepared for the final deportations. Anne Frank's month at Westerbork represented her introduction to the broader community of Dutch, Jewish survivors. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. After over 2 years of isolation in the secret annex with only 7 companions, she was suddenly surrounded by hundreds of other Jewish prisoners, each with their own story of survival and loss. The social dynamics of camp life, the formation of friendships and alliances, and the constant uncertainty about future deportations created a complex environment that tested everyone's psychological resilience. The work assignments at Westerbork reflected Nazi theories about the productive use of prisoner labor while maintaining the deportation system. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Prisoners were assigned to various tasks, manufacturing, construction, maintenance, and administration, that served both to occupy their time and to extract economic value from their labor. The Frank family members would have been assigned work details appropriate to their age and perceived abilities, becoming part of the camp's forced labor system. The selection process for deportation transports created an atmosphere of constant terror at Westerbork, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Each week, camp authorities would compile lists of prisoners for deportation to camps in the East, using criteria that often seemed arbitrary, but were actually based on Nazi racial theories and administrative convenience. Families lived in constant fear that their names would appear on the next transport list, while those who remained faced the psychological torment of watching friends and neighbors disappear into the unknown. On September 3, 1944, Anne Frank and her family had unknowingly joined the last major group of Dutch Jews to be deported from Westerbork, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, by this late stage of the war, with Allied forces advancing through France and the Soviet army pushing into Eastern Europe. The Nazi deportation machinery was operating under increasing time pressure. The last transports from Westerbork carried a sense of desperate urgency, as if the perpetrators understood that their opportunity for genocide was rapidly diminishing. The final deportation from Westerbork began on September 3, 1944, when 1,019 prisoners, including Anne Frank and her family, were loaded onto the last train that would carry Dutch Jews to the concentration camps, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This transport was different from earlier deportations in several crucial ways. It was scheduled during the late stages of the war, when German defeat was becoming increasingly likely, and its destination was Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most notorious of all Nazi concentration camps. Life in the women's barracks at Birkenau subjected Anne Frank to conditions that defied human comprehension. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The overcrowded wooden buildings housed hundreds of women in spaces designed for far fewer, with multiple prisoners forced to share narrow bunks infested with lice and other vermin. The deliberate starvation diet, consisting of watery soup and small pieces of bread, was calculated to weaken prisoners while extracting maximum labor before their inevitable deaths. The work assignments at Birkenau were designed as instruments of torture rather than productive labor. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Prisoners were forced to perform meaningless tasks, moving heavy stones from one location to another, digging ditches that would be filled in the next day, carrying loads that exceeded human capacity. The purpose was not economic productivity, but the systematic destruction of human spirit and physical strength. For Anne Frank, who had spent over 2 years reading, writing, and engaging in intellectual activities in the secret annex, the mental degradation of camp life may have been as devastating as the physical brutality. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The elimination of privacy, the constant surveillance, the reduction of human interaction to the most basic survival instincts, all of this represented an assault on the intellectual and emotional development that had sustained her through her years in hiding. The approach of winter 1944 brought additional hardships to Birkenau prisoners, as inadequate clothing and shelter made survival increasingly difficult. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Nazi authorities understood that winter conditions would increase mortality rates among prisoners, and they made no effort to provide adequate protection against cold, wet weather. For prisoners weakened by months of starvation and overwork, winter often meant death. In October 1944, as Soviet forces approached the Auschwitz complex, the Nazi authorities began evacuating prisoners westward to prevent their liberation by Allied armies. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Anne Frank and Margot Frank were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany, while their mother, Edith, remained at Birkenau. This separation would prove to be permanent, as the sisters would never see their mother again. The selection process for the transport to Bergen-Belsen followed the same arbitrary and cruel logic that characterized all Nazi procedures. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Younger prisoners who might survive transport and provide labor were chosen, while older or weaker prisoners were left behind to face either continued imprisonment or death. For families like the Franks, these selections meant permanent separation and the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing the fate of loved ones. The journey from Birkenau to Bergen-Belsen in October 1944 took place in open freight cars during increasingly cold weather. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The 3-day transport subjected prisoners to conditions of extreme exposure, with no protection from rain, wind, or freezing temperatures. Many prisoners died during the journey, and those who survived arrived at Bergen-Belsen in a severely weakened condition. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in late 1944 was experiencing the complete breakdown of its infrastructure and administrative systems. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Originally established as a prisoner of war camp and later converted to a concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen had become severely overcrowded as prisoners were evacuated from camps in Eastern Europe. The camp's facilities, never adequate for large numbers of prisoners, were completely overwhelmed by the influx of evacuees. The conditions at Bergen-Belsen that greeted Anne and Margot Frank in November 1944 were among the worst in the Nazi camp. System: United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Food supplies had virtually disappeared, with prisoners receiving starvation rations that provided insufficient calories for basic survival. Fresh water was scarce and contaminated, sanitation facilities were non-existent, and medical care was unavailable for the thousands of sick and dying prisoners. The complete absence of sanitation at Bergen-Belsen created ideal conditions for epidemic diseases. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Typhus, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and dysentery spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks. The camp authorities made no effort to control these epidemics, understanding that disease would accomplish their genocidal goals as efficiently as gas chambers while requiring less direct involvement. Winter 1944-1945 at Bergen-Belsen brought suffering that exceeded even the systematic cruelty of earlier concentration camps. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Prisoners had no adequate shelter from freezing temperatures, no fuel for heating, and no winter clothing. The combination of starvation, disease, exposure, and complete lack of medical care created mortality rates that shocked even hardened SS personnel. In this environment of systematic destruction, Anne and Margot Frank struggled to maintain their humanity and their connection to each other. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Witnesses who survived Bergen-Belsen later recalled seeing the two sisters supporting each other through the final months of their lives, sharing their meager food rations and providing emotional comfort in circumstances that had stripped away all other sources of hope. The typhus epidemic that swept through Bergen-Belsen in early 1945 claimed the lives of thousands of prisoners, including Anne and Margot Frank. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The exact date of their deaths is unknown, but it occurred sometime in February or March 1945, just weeks before British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945. The two sisters who had shared hopes and dreams in the secret annex died together in the horror of Bergen-Belsen. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen by British forces on April 15, 1945, revealed the full extent of Nazi genocide to a horrified world. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The liberators found approximately 55,000 prisoners still alive, many so weak they would die in the following weeks despite medical care. They also discovered thousands of unburied corpses and evidence of the systematic starvation and medical experimentation that had characterized the camp's operation. For Anne Frank, liberation came too late. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The 15-year-old girl who had filled her diary with dreams of becoming a famous writer had died just weeks before freedom arrived. Her death represented not just the loss of one promising young life, but the destruction of all the potential contributions she might have made to literature, journalism, and human understanding. Otto Frank was the only member of the secret annex group to survive the war. Anne Frank House. He was liberated from Auschwitz by Soviet forces in January 1945, but did not learn of his family's fate until he returned to Amsterdam later that year. The news that his wife and daughters had died just weeks before liberation represented a tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The story of Anne Frank's final months illustrates the systematic nature of Nazi genocide and the individual human costs of state-sponsored hatred. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her journey from the relative safety of the secret annex to death in Bergen-Belsen demonstrates how quickly civilized society can collapse into barbarism when prejudice and authoritarianism are allowed to flourish unchecked. But even as Anne Frank died in the horror of Bergen-Belsen, her voice was being preserved in Amsterdam by the helpers who had saved her diary. How would those scattered pages recovered from the floor of the secret annex eventually reach the world? What would it take to transform a teenage girl's private thoughts into one of the most influential books of the 20th century? And how would Anne Frank's death in obscurity lead to her posthumous role as one of history's most important witnesses to genocide? The liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945, brought Otto Frank freedom from the Nazi concentration camp system, but it also began a journey of discovery that would prove both heartbreaking and ultimately transformative for the world's understanding of the Holocaust. Anne Frank House. At 56 years old, Otto was among the few prisoners whose age and physical condition had allowed them to survive the brutal conditions of Nazi captivity, but he emerged from the camp as the sole survivor of a family that had once filled his life with joy and purpose. The journey from Auschwitz back to Amsterdam took Otto Frank several months, as transportation systems throughout Europe had been destroyed by years of warfare, and the continent struggled to accommodate millions of displaced persons. Anne Frank House. During this long journey home, Otto clung to the hope that his wife and daughters might have survived their deportation, that somehow they had endured the horrors he had witnessed and would be waiting for him in Amsterdam. The possibility of reunion sustained him through the difficult months of travel and uncertainty. Otto Frank's return to Amsterdam in June 1945 marked his re-entry into a world that had been fundamentally changed by 5 years of war and occupation. Anne Frank House. The city he had known as a refuge from Nazi persecution had been scarred by hunger, violence, and the systematic deportation of its Jewish population. Of the approximately 80,000 Jews who had lived in the Netherlands before the war, fewer than 25,000 had survived, making the Dutch Holocaust one of the most complete genocides in Western Europe. The building at 263 Prinsengracht stood as a silent monument to lives that had been lost. Anne Frank House. The offices of Opekta Works continued to operate under the management of Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who had survived their imprisonment and returned to maintain the business that had provided cover for the secret annex. But the hidden rooms behind the revolving bookcase remained empty, their furniture and personal belongings preserved as they had been left on August 4, 1944. It was Miep Gies who provided Otto Frank with both the devastating news of his family's fate and the precious gift that would transform his grief into global impact. Anne Frank House. On July 18, 1945, Miep told Otto that his wife Edith had died at Auschwitz-Birkenau and that Anne and Margot had perished at Bergen-Belsen. In that moment of crushing confirmation, she handed him Anne's diary papers, which she had preserved in her desk drawer since the day of the arrest. The red-checkered diary that Anne had received for her 13th birthday, along with the additional notebooks and loose pages she had filled during her time in hiding, represented more than personal memories. They contained the voice of a young woman who had maintained her humanity and hope in the face of systematic persecution. The two versions of Anne's diary, Otto's first reading of his daughter's private thoughts revealed a person he had never fully known, a writer whose talent and insight exceeded anything he had recognized during their years together. Anne's diary existed in two distinct versions, reflecting her own recognition of its potential historical importance. The two versions of Anne's diary, version A, consisted of her original entries written spontaneously as events unfolded during their time in hiding. Version B represented her conscious revision of the diary, begun in 1944 after hearing a Dutch government-in-exile radio broadcast calling for the preservation of war diaries and documents. This second version showed Anne's growing awareness that her experience might have significance beyond her personal record. The process of editing Anne's diary for publication required Otto Frank to make difficult decisions about privacy, historical accuracy, and the protection of living individuals mentioned in the text. Why did Anne Frank's father censor her diary? He removed passages that he considered too intimate for public consumption, references to sexuality that would have been shocking to 1940s readers, and criticisms of individuals who were still alive. While these editorial decisions later became controversial, they reflected Otto's desire to honor his daughter's memory while making her story accessible to the widest possible audience. The search for a publisher willing to take on Anne Frank's diary proved challenging in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Anne Frank house publishers in war-exhausted Europe were reluctant to invest in books about the Holocaust, believing that readers wanted to move beyond the trauma of recent years rather than confront additional accounts of suffering and persecution. Many publishing houses rejected the manuscript, viewing it as too depressing or too focused on Jewish experiences to appeal to general audiences. Finally, in 1947, the Dutch publishing house Contact agreed to publish Anne's diary under the title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex. Anne Frank House. The initial print run was modest, reflecting continued uncertainty about public interest in Holocaust literature. The book's publication on June 25, 1947, marked the beginning of Anne Frank's posthumous journey from victim of genocide to global symbol of hope and human resilience. The early reviews of Anne's diary in Dutch newspapers were respectful but not immediately enthusiastic. Anne Frank house critics praised the book's historical value and the author's writing ability, but few predicted the global impact it would eventually achieve. The Dutch public's initial response was similarly measured, as a war-weary population struggled to process the enormity of what had happened to their Jewish neighbors and fellow citizens. Otto Frank's dedication to promoting his daughter's diary reflected his understanding that Anne's voice represented something larger than personal tragedy. Anne Frank House. He recognized that her writing captured universal themes of adolescent development, family relationships, and human resilience that transcended the specific circumstances of the Holocaust. His tireless efforts to secure translations and international publications were motivated by a belief that Anne's message of hope and tolerance could help prevent future genocides. The transformation of Anne Frank from unknown Holocaust victim to international symbol began with the simple act of publication, but it would require years of dedicated effort by Otto Frank and others to bring her story to global attention. Anne Frank House. The process of translation into other languages, adaptation for different cultural contexts, and promotion to international audiences would transform a private diary into one of the most widely read books in human history. But even as the first copies of Anne's diary appeared in Dutch bookstores in 1947, questions remained about its ultimate impact and significance. How would readers in other countries respond to the story of a Jewish girl in hiding? What would it take to transform Anne Frank from a local Dutch publication into a global phenomenon? And could Otto Frank have imagined that his daughter's private thoughts would eventually reach millions of readers and fundamentally change how the world understood the Holocaust. The transformation of Anne Frank's diary from a modest Dutch publication to an international phenomenon required the convergence of literary merit, historical timing, and the dedicated efforts of individuals who recognized its universal significance. The Diary of a Young Girl. Wikipedia. By 1950, the initial Dutch edition had sold steadily enough to encourage contact publishers to consider international editions, setting in motion a process that would eventually bring Anne's voice to readers in over 70 languages and make her one of the most widely read authors in history. The first major breakthrough came with the German translation, published in 1950 as Das Tagebuch der Anne Frank, The Diaries of Anne Frank. The decision to publish Anne's diary in Germany represented a complex emotional and political challenge, as it meant presenting the story of a Jewish girl's persecution to the very population whose government had orchestrated the Holocaust. The German public's reception of the book would serve as an early test of Europe's willingness to confront the reality of Nazi crimes and their consequences. The German edition's success surprised both publishers and cultural critics as readers embraced Anne's story with an enthusiasm that suggested genuine remorse and a desire for reconciliation. The diaries of Anne Frank young German readers, in particular, identified with Anne's struggles and dreams, finding in her diary a bridge between their wartime experiences and hopes for a more tolerant future. This response demonstrated the book's ability to transcend national boundaries and speak to universal human experiences. The English translation, published in Britain in 1952 and in the United States in 1952 under the title The Diary of a Young Girl, brought Anne's story to the English-speaking world and exponentially expanded her potential readership. This Day in History. Diary of Anne Frank, published in 1947. The American edition, in particular, found an audience ready to embrace stories of courage and resistance as the United States was beginning to grapple with its own complex relationship to the Holocaust and its aftermath. American readers' response to Anne's diary reflected the country's growing awareness of the Holocaust and its moral implications for international relations. The Diary of a Young Girl, Wikipedia. The book appeared during the early Cold War period, when Americans were increasingly conscious of the need to defend democratic values against totalitarian threats. Anne's story provided a personal and accessible entry point into understanding the consequences of prejudice and authoritarianism. The adaptation of Anne's diary for the stage marked a crucial step in its transformation from historical document to cultural phenomenon. The Diary of a Young Girl, Wikipedia. The play, written by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, and first performed on Broadway in 1955, brought Anne's story to theatrical audiences and won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The stage adaptation introduced dramatic elements and character development that made the story more accessible to audiences unfamiliar with the historical context. However, the theatrical adaptation also began a process of popularization that would later generate controversy among historians and critics. The Diary of a Young Girl. Wikipedia. The play emphasized Anne's optimism and hope while downplaying the specifically Jewish aspects of her experience, creating a version of her story that appealed to universal audiences but potentially diminished the historical specificity of the Holocaust. This tension between accessibility and historical accuracy would continue to shape discussions of Anne Frank's legacy. The 1959 Hollywood film adaptation, starring Millie Perkins as Anne Frank, brought her story to even wider audiences through the medium of cinema. The Diary of a Young Girl, Wikipedia. The movie's commercial success demonstrated the entertainment industry's recognition of the story's dramatic power and commercial viability, but it also raised questions about the appropriateness of transforming Holocaust experiences into popular entertainment. Throughout the 1950s, Otto Frank worked tirelessly to promote international editions of his daughter's diary, while maintaining careful control over its presentation and interpretation. Otto Frank, Wikipedia. He established the Anne Frank Foundation in 1957 to preserve her memory and promote the educational use of her story, recognizing that her diary's growing fame required institutional support to ensure its continued historical accuracy and moral impact. The establishment of the Anne Frank House as a museum in 1960 marked the institutionalization of Anne's legacy and provided a permanent site for visitors to connect with her story. Anne Frank House. The preservation of the secret annex, including the revolving bookcase and the small rooms where 8 people had hidden for over 2 years, created a physical memorial that complemented the literary memorial of the diary itself. The growing international recognition of Anne Frank's diary during the 1950s coincided with broader cultural and political developments that influenced how her story was received and interpreted. The Diary of a Young Girl. Wikipedia. The emergence of human rights as a global political priority, the establishment of Israel as a Jewish homeland, and the beginning of civil rights movements in various countries all provided contexts that enhanced the relevance of Anne's message of tolerance and human dignity. Educational institutions began incorporating Anne's diary into curricula around the world, recognizing its value both as historical documentation and as literature that could engage young readers with serious moral and political questions. The Diary of a Young Girl, Wikipedia. Teachers found that students connected readily with Anne's voice and perspective, making her diary an effective tool for teaching about the Holocaust, prejudice, and the importance of protecting human rights. The scholarly study of Anne's diary also began during this period, as historians and literary critics recognized its significance as both a historical document and a work of literature. The Diary of Anne Frank. The revised critical edition academic analysis would eventually reveal the sophistication of Anne's writing, the careful structure of her narrative, and the ways in which her work reflected and illuminated broader patterns of Holocaust experience. By 1960, Anne Frank had been transformed from an unknown teenage victim of genocide into a global symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of the written word to preserve human dignity in the face of systematic persecution. Anne Frank House. But this transformation also raised new questions about the relationship between individual stories and historical truth, the responsibilities of memory, and the ways in which personal narratives can shape collective understanding of traumatic events. How would Anne Frank's growing fame influence public understanding of the Holocaust? What responsibilities came with the stewardship of her legacy? And could her father Otto have imagined that his decision to publish his daughter's diary would eventually create one of the most powerful educational tools for teaching tolerance and human rights? As the 1960s began, Anne Frank's journey from victim to symbol was entering a new phase that would test the enduring power of her message. The decades following 1960 witnessed the transformation of Anne Frank from historical figure to cultural icon, a process that brought both greater global recognition of her message and increasing complexity in how her story was interpreted and used. The Diary of a Young Girl, Wikipedia. As her diary was translated into more languages and reached new generations of readers, questions emerged about the relationship between Anne Frank as symbol and Anne Frank as historical person, challenging educators, historians, and the public to balance accessibility with historical accuracy. The 1970s and 1980s saw renewed scholarly interest in Anne Frank's diary, driven partly by the emergence of Holocaust studies as an academic discipline, and partly by growing concerns about historical revisionism and denial. The diary of Anne Frank, the revised critical edition. Holocaust deniers had begun questioning the authenticity of various Holocaust documents, including Anne's diary, making rigorous scholarly analysis both an academic necessity and a moral imperative to preserve historical truth. The publication of The Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition, in 1986 represented a watershed moment in Anne Frank's scholarship, providing comprehensive analysis of the diary's various versions, detailed examination of the handwriting and paper, and extensive historical context. The Diary of Anne Frank, the revised critical edition. This scholarly edition definitively established the diary's authenticity while revealing the sophistication of Anne's writing and the careful thought she had given to potential publication. The critical edition also addressed one of the most sensitive aspects of Anne Frank's legacy, the differences between her original writing and the versions that Otto Frank had prepared for publication. Why did Anne Frank's father edit and censor her diary? The restoration of previously omitted passages revealed Anne's candid discussions of sexuality, more critical assessments of the adults around her, and deeper engagement with Jewish identity, presenting a more complex and fully human portrait of the teenage author. The revelation of these editorial choices sparked debates about historical authenticity, literary integrity, and the responsibilities of those who preserve and present historical documents. For Anne Frank's 90th birthday, dueling versions of her diary, some critics argued that Otto Frank's edits had sanitized his daughter's voice and diminished the specifically Jewish aspects of her experience, while others maintained that his editorial decisions had been necessary to ensure the diary's acceptance and impact in the social climate of the 1950s. The digital age brought new opportunities and challenges for preserving and disseminating Anne Frank's legacy. Anne Frank House. The Anne Frank House developed online educational resources, virtual museum tours, and digital archives that made her story accessible to global audiences while maintaining scholarly standards. These technological innovations expanded the reach of Anne's message while raising new questions about how digital media might affect the reading and interpretation of her diary. Educational use of Anne Frank's diary continued to expand throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, but it also generated ongoing debates about pedagogical approaches and historical context. Anne Frank House. Some educators advocated for teaching Anne's story as part of comprehensive Holocaust education, emphasizing the systematic nature of Nazi genocide and the broader historical context of European anti-Semitism. Others focused on the universal themes in her writing, using her story to teach about tolerance, human rights, and the dangers of prejudice. The question of universalization versus particularization became a central tension in Anne Frank education and commemoration. Anne Frank House. While her story's universal appeal had undoubtedly contributed to its global impact, some historians and Jewish community leaders worried that emphasizing universal themes might obscure the specifically Jewish nature of her persecution and the unique characteristics of the Holocaust as a historical event. Contemporary discussions of Anne Frank's legacy have been complicated by the rise of new forms of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and the politicization of Holocaust memory. Anne Frank House. As survivors of the Holocaust age and die, Anne's diary has become even more crucial as a primary source document, but it has also been subjected to new forms of distortion and misappropriation by those seeking to advance political agendas. The 75th anniversary of Anne Frank's death in 2020 prompted renewed reflection on her continuing relevance in an era of rising authoritarianism, refugee crises, and global challenges to democratic values. Anne Frank House, educators and activists have found new applications for her message in addressing contemporary issues such as cyberbullying, social media harassment, and the persecution of minority communities around the world. The ongoing stewardship of Anne Frank's legacy by the Anne Frank Foundation and the Anne Frank House represents an attempt to balance preservation of historical accuracy with contemporary relevance. Anne Frank House. These institutions work to ensure that Anne's story continues to educate new generations while maintaining the integrity of her voice and the historical context of her experience. Recent scholarship has also examined Anne Frank's development as a writer, recognizing her diary not just as historical testimony, but as a significant work of literature in its own right. The complete works of Anne Frank. Analysis of her writing style, narrative techniques, and intellectual development has revealed a young author of remarkable talent whose potential contributions to literature were cut short by genocide. The story of Anne Frank's diary, from its creation in a hidden annex to its status as one of the world's most widely read books, illustrates the power of individual voices to transcend historical circumstances and speak to universal human experiences. Anne Frank House. Her transformation from Holocaust victim to global symbol demonstrates both the importance of preserving historical memory and the complex processes through which personal narratives become part of collective consciousness. As we move further into the 21st century, Anne Frank's diary continues to find new readers and new relevance. Anne Frank House. Her voice, preserved by chance and circumstance from the flames of genocide, remains a powerful reminder of the human capacity for hope, creativity, and moral courage in the face of systematic evil. The teenage girl who once wrote by candlelight in a hidden room has become a permanent part of human cultural memory, ensuring that her message of tolerance and human dignity will continue to challenge and inspire future generations. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Anne Frank's story is not just what she endured, but what she created, a testament to the power of words to preserve the human spirit and to the possibility of finding hope and meaning even in humanity's darkest hours. Her diary stands as proof that individual voices matter, that bearing witness has power, and that even in death, the right words at the right time can continue to change the world.